Hey, I'm Rebecca from the blog and YouTube channel Moon and Magnolia, and I had an entirely different video planned for you today. I was planning on sharing with you how to can convenience foods, but we are snowed in and I cannot get the supplies that I need. So we're going to switch gears a little bit just for today and back things up, and I'm going to show you how to preserve food, especially if you are a beginner. So these clips are from my vlogs, and if you're not familiar with them or haven't watched them, in my regular vlogs, I share little mini tutorials. So I've pulled these little mini tutorials out and put them into one compilation for you. There are timestamps for each of the food preservation methods, so use them if you need them. And there are also links to the full-length videos in the description box, so check those out. But without further ado, let's get into these food preservation methods for beginners. We have been harvesting food from gardens and getting food from local farms for quite a while now, but I am trying to harvest and preserve whatever I can from my garden right now so we can enjoy it later. And one of my absolute favorite things to preserve from the garden is basil, particularly homemade pesto. And this is really nice because whether or not you have a huge garden, a homestead, or just a small pot of basil, you can preserve pesto at home to enjoy all year. Last year and this year, I made walnut pesto because pine nuts are so expensive. So I just get a big bag of walnuts at Costco or Sam's. To make this particular recipe, I am putting 2 cups of fresh basil from the garden in a food processor. I'm also adding in about 2 cloves of garlic. This garlic is from my garden and some of it grew really well and some was small. So I'm using up the small garlic cloves first, and then 1/3 of a cup of walnuts. And then I'm pulsing that in the food processor just until it's a little chunky. And then I'm adding in about 1/2 cup of Parmesan cheese and 1/2 cup of olive oil. You can add more or less olive oil depending on what type of consistency you want. I prefer mine a little bit chunky, and you can always add more oil to your dish whenever you are using the pesto, so I don't worry about that too much at this point. Basil is the gift that keeps on giving in a garden. My friend and I were just talking about how all of our tomatoes died this summer and everything has been a mess in our gardens, but the basil, it is going strong. So if you are thinking about starting a garden next year, I really recommend growing basil, if nothing else, because it's so easy. And then come midwinter, when it's cold and it's hard to get fresh, really beautiful food, you have some stowed away in your freezer and you can have fresh pesto. To capture this late summer flavor, I like to freeze individual portions of pesto. So this is enough for one dinner, and I have 4 bags that I am putting inside of a larger freezer bag. And I like to label it with what came from the garden so that way in February I know what was from our harvests. One of my goals for this year is to can enough of the foods that we really love to last us for a year. And one of the foods that we cannot get enough of, especially my 3-year-old, is peaches. And we are really lucky because we live close to the border of South Carolina, and South Carolina peaches are delicious. So last year and this year, I bought peaches from a local farmer's market at a wholesale price. So sometimes if you go to your local farmer's market or even to a local farm, they will sell their produce at a cheaper price if you buy a lot of it. So I was able to get these peaches at a really good price, and I am going to can them. Now, this batch of peaches is not enough to last us for a full year, especially because I think my child could eat a full jar of peaches every single day. But what I do is every week or every few weeks while peaches are in season, I get a big basket of them like this, and then I can them throughout the season. I am not a master food preservationist. There are people who actually are master food preservationists. They have certificates in it and they know a lot more than I do. I follow all of the instructions to a T from the National Center for Home Food Preservation because they are tested recipes. So I'm going to leave the links for that in the description box below. So if you want to learn how to can peaches, it's probably best, and well, it's actually for sure best that you learn from an expert. But I will show you here just sort of what I do along the way. Here I am just putting the peaches in boiling water for about 45 seconds and taking them out and then putting them directly into cold water. And this helps the skin release. And one thing you should know about canning peaches, and this is true for tomatoes too, is it's like a wet, sloppy mess. You have your water bath canner, then you have the boiling water, then you have ice water, and then another bowl of water to put your sliced peaches in, and the peaches themselves are messy. So do be prepared for a little bit of a messy, wet kitchen. But you can see here that when the peaches are ripe, the skins slip right off. When they're not ripe, and I made this mistake with a couple of them, the skins are still a little hard to take off. I work with the peaches in batches, and while I am doing that, I also have the jars in the dishwasher. And that may or may not be necessary depending on the guidelines for your recipe. Just check out the recipe and the National Center for Home Food Preservation for that. But I keep my jars in the garage, so they just need to be washed. And once they are done in the dishwasher, I'm now loading them up into my water bath canner just to keep them warm, because I will be doing a hot pack for the peaches, so I need hot jars to put hot food in to prevent the jars from breaking. The reason I even started canning food and peaches in the first place is because last year when my daughter was 2, she was just housing peaches. And I looked at the ingredients for canned peaches because I was buying like the pre-canned or jarred peaches. And I just wasn't super excited about the amount of sugar that was in them. So I decided to can my own. And what I like about this is, yes, you do can them in a syrup, but you can can them in an extra light syrup. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation has different recipes for different syrups, ranging from extra light all the way to a heavy syrup. So this is the extra light syrup. It's 6.5 cups of water and 3/4 cups of sugar for the entire batch of peaches. While these peaches come to a boil, I'm going to get all of the other supplies ready. And that is a useful tip for canning, is just to make sure you have all the things you need ready to go. It's not like a super rushed or time sensitive project necessarily, but there are a lot of moving parts, and it's just a lot easier if you have everything ready to go. I can most of my food in small batches because that's how much time I have. So this small batch of peaches I did between the time I brought my daughter home from preschool and it was time to take her to gymnastics. And then I did the rest of the peaches after she went to bed. Now that may or may not work for everyone. It's technically maybe a little more time consuming that way, but it's the only way this works for my schedule. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize here is that if you are interested in things like food preservation and canning food for yourself and your family, but feel like you just don't have time to do it, there are ways just to do it in small batches in the pockets of time that you can. And maybe you don't have food prepared for a year, and that's okay. But maybe you can preserve just a little bit of food to enjoy as a treat throughout the year. That's a totally great and viable option. I don't really stockpile a ton of food. I do try to keep a year's worth of some foods in our house, things like peaches and tomatoes, things that we consume a lot of that I could either get from the farmer's market or my own garden and keep around. But honestly, I don't really have the space in my pantry to have a year's worth of everything. So even if you're just canning a little bit of stuff here and there, or just canning a year's worth of your favorite things, that's a great option. I really wanted to learn how to can food like 10 years ago. That was like on my bucket list to preserve my own food, but I actually felt really intimidated by the process. But it's actually very simple once you know what to do. And it can feel intimidating in the beginning, but if you follow a tested recipe, follow the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and also Ball has really good recipes that are tested too. They are easy and simple. And if you're canning or preserving things that you really love and that you'll actually consume throughout the year, it is not wasted effort and is not wasted time. It is so awesome in the middle of January on a cold winter's day to open up a can of tomatoes or peaches that you canned in the summer. There's nothing like it. Are thinly slicing some cabbage. So I cut the cabbage in half, poured it, and now I am thinly slicing it. A few weeks ago, I posted a video about fermenting peppers and onions, and I'll put that link in the description box below. But in that, I mentioned that I like to make the brine first and then put it over the vegetables. But when it comes to sauerkraut, it's a little bit different. The process is actually the same once the salt is on the vegetables, but it works a little bit better for cabbage to actually put the salt directly onto the cabbage and then make the brine that way. So now that it's thinly sliced, I washed it and made sure it's really clean. And now I'm just putting it into a large bowl and weighing it. And I'm weighing it because that determines how much salt to use. I'm using about 1.5 teaspoons, 2 teaspoons or so per pound of cabbage. So in this case, I do recommend weighing the cabbage and then adding the appropriate amount of salt. So now I'm just sprinkling the salt over and mixing it in nicely and then just letting it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. So she hung out and cut her cabbage up while I mixed the cabbage and the salt together and massaged it for about 5 minutes until it was really watery. Now this becomes the brine. So don't pour this water out. Keep it in the bowl and then take a glass jar. I like to use a food funnel and then begin to put the cabbage in the jar. Now make sure you're really packing that cabbage in there. I think that was like a 2, maybe 2.5 pound cabbage, and I fit the entire thing in this one jar. So I'm just taking the handle of a wooden spoon and giving it a good smash in there and really filling that jar up. And once it's filled up with cabbage and really packed down, I'm just taking all that liquid that's left in the bottom and filling the jar with it. And I guess it's not actually all of the liquid. I'm just using as much liquid as I can fit into the jar. One of the things to keep in mind about sauerkraut is that it gets really pressurized and that liquid needs somewhere to go. So I'm putting a glass fermentation weight on top to hold it down. You could use a cabbage leaf like I showed in that video a few weeks ago with the peppers and onions. Then I'm using a pickle pipe, which allows the fermentation gases to release, and I'm screwing a little lid on it. But here's the thing, I'm also putting it inside of a bowl because that bowl will catch any liquid that leaks out, because that does happen as it begins to ferment. That gas needs to push that liquid out somewhere. So that'll help catch that liquid. And now I have this big bucket of strawberries that I want to preserve. I have a full blog post that I just published over on moonandmagnolia.com about how to freeze dry strawberries, but also to preserve the strawberries that my daughter picked. I like to make homemade strawberry jam. And what I really like about preserving these strawberries is that it's like freezing a little moment in time, because we did this together and it's not just food that we can eat now, but it's something that's preserved. And so in a year or so when we eat it again, we can revisit all those sweet memories. The recipe for this jam is from the Ball Book of Canning. I'll leave a link for that in the description box below, but it is a tested recipe and safe to use. So to do this, I just wash the strawberries, cut off any bruised parts, make sure to get rid of any that are moldy or kind of funny looking, hold them, dice them, and now I am just kind of smashing them in this bowl. I don't really need to totally mush them down into nothing, but I do want to release those juices so that way when we begin to cook it, they can mix in with the sugar. So I'm putting this in a nice heavy pot. I'm using my stove cast iron Dutch oven, and then I am mixing in some lemon juice. When you are canning and a recipe calls for lemon juice, you should use the store-bought lemon juice, and that is because it raises the acid level. That's what makes it safe for canning. And then I'm mixing in a full 6 cups of sugar. It's a lot of sugar. It's hard to even think about how much sugar is in there, but I'm only eating it like a teaspoon at a time, so it is okay. There are 2 ways of making jam. One is a fast way, which you use added pectin and it works really quickly. And the other way is called a long cook and you do not use added pectin. Now, it's not called a long cook for nothing. I'm just gonna let you know it took a while for this. It needs to reach 220 degrees, which is above the point of boiling, at least at my elevation, which is like 0 because I live at the beach. So I had to reach 220 degrees, and honestly, that took a lot longer than I thought. So now that it finally hit 220 degrees Fahrenheit, I am ladling it into prepared hot jars. I plan on sharing some more videos in the future as we head into full-blown food preservation about how to prepare your canner, what to do with the jars, and etc. But for now, I am just ladling the hot strawberries into hot jars and getting them ready. So in case you're wondering, the difference between water bath canning and pressure canning is really the acid level of the food. So high acid foods can be water bath canned, and adding that lemon juice is what raised the acid high enough to be able to can this jam. A moment ago, I mentioned to use store-bought lemon juice, and that's because the acid or the pH of that is pretty standard and regulated. However, that is not the case, of course, with a fresh lemon. So it's kind of a toss-up if you use a fresh lemon, but a tested recipe is always using store-bought lemon juice. Now, for pressure canning, that means the food has low acid. So foods that have low acid have to be pressure canned, and foods that have high acid can be water bath canned. I also preserved garlic chives in butter. Now you can do this with any type of herb in your garden, but I really like garlic chives because it makes delicious garlic bread. So here all I did is finely chop up some chives and put them in a small bowl. There are no strict rules about how much you need in terms of herbs. I found that what I have in the bowl is good for my taste preferences for about 2 sticks of butter. So you'll need whatever you have in herbs plus 1 or more sticks of room temperature butter. You definitely want to make sure it's not cold and it is truly room temperature, so that way you can mash it into the herbs. I also added in about a tablespoon or so of store-bought lemon juice and some coarse kosher salt. Of course, you can change and adjust the ingredients to suit your preferences, but once you get everything in the bowl, it's time to just mix and mash until everything is nicely combined. To save space and for easeful use, I like to take my compound butters and shape them into a butter roll. So to do this, you'll just need to clean off your countertop, grab a piece of parchment paper, and place your compound butter mixture onto your parchment paper. Somewhere between the middle of the parchment paper will work just fine. Then you'll notice here, my child was starting to get into things and I was pretty distracted, so I made a mistake, but just bear with me, all will be fine in the end. You will just fold the parchment paper over and make sure that you have some sort of tool that has a flat edge, like a cookie sheet, or in this case, I'm using a little wire baking rack. This is where I messed up. So you can see I'm holding both ends of the parchment paper. You should hold just the bottom end of the parchment paper, so that way when you push the flat end of the sheet away from you, it can actually roll. But this still worked out just fine. It just wasn't quite as easy as it could have been, but it was a beautiful butter roll. It's going to taste delicious. Just roll it on up, fold the ends over, throw it in a freezer bag, and you have preserved homegrown herbs that you can use for fall and even through winter. I make garlic bread with this all the time. I also preserve basil this way, and I just chop some of the frozen butter up, threw it right on top of some garden fresh tomatoes with a little bit of Parmesan cheese and threw it in the oven, and it was fantastic. That I need to use, and my child loves apple chips, so I am dehydrating them in a few different ways that I'll share with you today. So on this night, and it was nighttime because sometimes you have to do this stuff when your kid's asleep, I was just getting the apples washed and prepared for dehydration. So all you need to do is just give them a good rinse and then fill up a bowl with water and then add in some fruit fresh. This will prevent the apples from browning while you're chopping them. And then I chop these or slice them by hand. There are lots of fancy tools out there that you can use to slice apples. I don't have any of them, so I did it old school style. As you slice them, put them in the water to prevent them from browning. And this really is a little bit of a labor of love. It takes some time to slice apples, but you can taste test them along the way and they are pretty good. I have a Kasori dehydrator, which I will link in the description box below. I really like it. So in the past, I used the stackable dehydrator where the trays stack on top of each other and it heats from the bottom. But with the Kasori, the trays slide in and the heat blows from the back of the dehydrator. So you get a more even dehydration this way. I think this is a great investment. They're not super expensive, but I do think it's worth the price to upgrade a little bit to this type of dehydrator. When you're getting the apples on the trays, make sure that they are just in a single layer and not overlapping. You can see here, I'm pulling them out of the water and just trying to get as much water off as I can, but it's okay if they're still a little wet because they will dehydrate, of course. Again, this was nighttime, so my husband poured me a glass of wine, and I have to say, dehydrating apples and drinking wine is a great date night if you ask me. In total, I tried 3 ways of dehydrating apples: plain, cinnamon, and caramel. But on this night, I just did the plain and cinnamon. If you want to skip ahead to the dehydrated caramel apples, just go to the description box below and you'll see the chapter markers there and you can skip right to it. I do want to note that when you're sprinkling the cinnamon, just make sure you have something under your tray to catch the mess. I use this little silicone sheet that actually came with the dehydrator, and then I even put it on the bottom of the dehydrator to catch anything that might fall, just to make cleanup easier the next day. So here we are the next day, and I'm just checking the apples. I let this run all night. You can test to see if your food is done by bending it to see if it's crisp and by taste testing. Okay, so I'm gonna try the apples. So this is one without cinnamon. It's really good. Sorry, I have a little apple monster back here, but she loves these. It's a little chewy. You want them to be crisp when they are dehydrated. I'm gonna try a cinnamon one. She's rolling apples across the counter. The cinnamon is really good. More. I need more. Piper, do you like your apples?
They're not done yet.
They're not done yet. We need to make salted caramel sauce. So to do this, one, make sure you have all your ingredients prepared first. This is very time sensitive, so you don't want to be running around your kitchen. Two, when you're putting the sugar, water, and corn syrup into your sauce pot, be really careful about not letting it hit the sides of the pot because that will eventually burn and it will make the flavor of your caramel sauce pretty bad. So you really want to be careful as you're pouring and just lightly mixing that you don't let any of the ingredients hit the sides of the pot. While this cooks on medium heat, you can swirl it, but do not stir it because again, you don't want to get it on the sides of the pot. And you can see after this is about 10 minutes, the color is starting to change. Once the color of the cooked sugar hits that caramelly, warm, golden brown, immediately pour your cream in and turn off the heat. That will stop the cooking. And now you can start to stir. And it gets a little weird in the beginning. You can see it kind of separates, but keep stirring. It'll come together. Then add in your cubed butter, vanilla, and salt. The link for this recipe is in the description box below. It is very easy to make, but it is a little bit time sensitive and a little delicate. So be sure to read the instructions carefully before you make this. Once that was done, I just poured it into a jar and let it cool. Do keep in mind it is very hot, so be careful with this as it cools. And then it's time to chop more apples. I'm not going to make you watch me chop more apples, but do know that I chop them, put them in a bowl, and then stir them together with some of the caramel sauce. The water from the apples actually help thin the sauce so they get nicely coated. And then it was the same as before. Put them on the tray so they're not overlapping and slide them into the dehydrator and let them cook until they are ready. It's caramel apples on the right. You can see they're a little bit darker than the ones on the left from the night before, which we ate a lot of, by the way. They are very good. They do not taste like a traditional caramel apple because the apple, of course, is cooked and dehydrated, but they have a really nice caramelly undertone and sweetness to them. And an added bonus is that my house smelled like a caramel apple while they were dehydrating. That's it for today. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. One of the best ways you can support the content creators that you love is to watch their content until the end. So if you're here, thank you. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, one of the best ways to stay in the know with all of the Moon and Magnolia happenings is to join the email list. When you join, I will send you links to all of my videos, blogs, tutorials, recipes, and more directly to your inbox. Thanks so much for stopping by today. We'll get back to our regularly scheduled programming soon, and I'll see you again next time.